So after watching that documentary clip, um, you're seeing so many different levels in which there was a different America than the America that we expect now, right? And of course, most of our clothes are still made by child labor, or I shouldn't say most. All too much is still made in nations that are democratic or dictatorial, that businesses are allowed to thrive and have different labor laws than we've made now, right? So moving on from there, Mother Jones, don't forget her name. She's awesome. So another little old lady that I am in love with. All right. So I think that documentary and what you see in the book kind of helps illustrate the way that America had to resolve what to do with our kids, right? Okay, and the conditions that they were under, and there were people taking pictures showing what was happening. Now, um, we're gonna just briefly go over about the issue of containing the socialist movement and this progressive era, and I just kind of want to quickly say something right now, and I hope I'm not going to take too much time. Uh, I have been reflecting on this era and what we see now, and looking at the past, and really wanting us to kind of decide a more complex view of to think about social relations. Forgive me. What am I saying? All right, let me make this more clear. A lot of Americans study this, and they don't know how to even almost handle this information, right? And a lot of Americans feel, we still have a lot of guilt or not guilt or anger or whatever over the issues of slavery. We're talking about Native Americans. We're talking about the rights of children and all these things. And, there's this whole issue now about the politically correct movement in America, whether people go too far, are they too sensitive now to everything. I kind of just want to point this out because I do teach world history and I read excessively a lot of different cultural text, books from Scandinavian history, British Isles, Middle East, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Slavery has been a normal condition of humanity, not just white and black. Actually, the majority of slavery has been white on white, if you want to put it in those terms, or black on black. In other words, most of the time, slaves don't look ethnically very different than, let's say, the people who own them. And we have classism has been assumed the normal thing within most human cultures. Most human cultures, when I say human culture, just say culture, right? Most societal cultures assumed that men were on top of women and the children. Okay, so sexism, as we would call it now, or gender supremacy of males. Okay, and children having rights, women having rights, a normal a person, a working class person, a servant having rights. These are not normal things that have been assumed in any given society. I've been reading a book on Sweden, and Morberg, the writer Morberg, said that basically up until the 1920s, servants could still be physically hit by their masters. I don't know much about this law or the context or not, but that essentially you look at many societies and those kind of things were normal. And, children, chimney boys were, in Britain, for example, were sometimes starved so that they could be skinny enough to get in and clean the chimneys of rich people. Can you believe this kind of thing? Okay? And it's really not until we get into the 19th century that you see on a large scale people who have been put down, claiming that they have a right not to be. So as you saw in the when I began this discussion a while back on John C. Calhoun, the rich and powerful U.S. senator, arguing that there's always been one class living off another and basically saying, tough, that's how it always works in civilization. And then Karl Marx saying, yeah, you're right. And guess what? Workers of the world unite. It doesn't have to happen anymore, okay? And so you started having these kind of arguments counter that. Now, again, whether or not Marx had the right solution or not, that's a different debate that we're having. But I think that what I'm trying to argue is that the idea that women, workers, and children have rights is a relatively recent thing, and that an ethnic group that's discriminated against would have a right is a relative recent argument, okay? And that instead of just seeing our society as keep in mind that the things that were happening here were a part of the broader world set of issues. And that I will say this, that regardless of whether or not you think the socialist movement or progressives had it right in their views, that they're probably one of the first sets of movements that actually articulated a kind of political ideology representing workers and asserting that workers do have inalienable rights. Okay? And this is where there's a conflict sometimes about the issue of the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers of the U.S. government weren't from that era that it was assumed that all workers, like when the idea of liberty and rights in the United States that the founders were writing on, it's not that I think that they thought about being discriminatory towards the average worker, but they were still men of their class and men of their time. They came out of a European context. And so that's where sometimes you have certain historians that seem like they're demoting the Founding Fathers because of that lack of hindsight. I mean, many had slaves, some were opposed to slavery. Some maybe had more amicable view towards workers' rights, others not so much. But again, I'm just kind of pointing out that these were all products of the time and that there's something unique going on in this idea about having rights, okay? By the way, when I was a kid in kindergarten at Fremont Elementary, if you signed a permission slip, the principal could still hit you. Again, standards have changed. Some people think that should go back to that. Well, that's another debate. I'm simply saying things have changed. Okay. So, moving on just a little bit, just to say that while many socialists were writing books like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, he meant to try to promote a better condition for workers. What many people saw in that book was the condition of their food. And so, not everybody had to work in a meat plant, but unless they were vegetarian, everybody was eating the meat, rich and poor. And what this socialist pointed out, rat droppings in your sausage, for example, and all that kind of stuff. When investigations were made, and Roosevelt did do some investigations as well, there was complete shock and horror. And so the food, getting food to be regulated and having, also drugs that we're, at the time there wasn't regulation. Someone could just sell you a bottle and say that it cures anything, and there was no one holding them accountable. So again, this is where the government starts stepping in and taking a more active role in things like food and drugs. Okay, and so I just want to move on here then. And how was this helped? Well, you had journalists going into places showing pictures of child laborers, children with missing limbs, food that was in bad conditions, and they were called muckrakers. That was a term used for these ones that were showing an abuse by government and business, right? Okay. And we had the 17th Amendment comes along here, and I'm actually just going to move on from that. Forgive me. So, again, there were... well, actually, I'm just going to move on from this section. Okay, so I'm going to end this a portion on the issue of Black America and white America and what this all had in relations to them. It's a very important topic because, again, we still haven't resolved this in the first place. And actually, this is after I do this next lecture, I'll be ending this section this chapter.